Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And today I'm giving my review of In a Violent Nature. Also, I'm recording this like super early in the morning. It's like 6 a.m. or something right now because that's the only time that I have to film this video. I have to work all weekend, but I'm trying to get this review out as quickly as possible. So that's why the lighting probably looks a little bit weird and I'm trying to be a little bit quiet so I don't wake up any of my roommates. Okay, so In a Violent Nature, where to start with this film. This was a film that I was looking forward to. It looked super interesting from the trailers, just the overall aesthetic of it. Obviously, this is a film that's trying to homage the slasher films of the 1980s, specifically Friday the 13th. And I know coming out of Sundance, it was getting a lot of buzz as kind of being a classic slasher film mixed with a more art house vibe. So I was curious to see how they were gonna bring these two elements together and if they were actually going to be able to pull it off. I saw this on a Wednesday night. It was a preview screening that AMC theaters were doing, and they put it in like the tiniest room in the whole theater, but it was packed. It was full of horror fans, which was pretty awesome. I feel like that's kind of the best way to see a movie like this. So my overall thoughts, I'm gonna be honest, I'm still not sure how I feel about this movie. There's a lot to admire about it and there's a lot that I liked about it, but I feel like it's going to be very divisive. I'm curious to see what the overall reaction is going to be as more people start to see it, because it does have a more experimental feel to it. Now, when I say experimental, I'm not talking about something in the veins of like Skinamarink, for example, but this is a film that is playing with narrative. And what I really mean by playing with narrative is that kind of does away completely with the narrative, and there's not the typical story structure that we are used to in these kinds of movies. So I think that's going to frustrate a lot of people. Also, this is a film that if you look at any of the promotional material for it, or any of the horror news outlets or blogs that have been talking about this movie, they are very much hyping it up as a slasher film that solely takes place within the point of view of the killer. Now, taking on the point of view of the killer in a slasher film, honestly, this is nothing new. We see this get played out all the time, right? We've certainly had films where we are actually following the killer along and we are meant to identify with them in some way. Or you just have the classic example that we've seen thousands of times in which you have a slasher film. The point of view is oscillating between the killer and then the victims. Oftentimes the camera will be taking on the point of view of the killer. So you are actually looking at everything, at the surroundings through their eyes, right? We've seen countless examples of this. This film, however, In a Violent Nature, doesn't actually do that. There's never a point where the camera lens is meant to act as the POV of the killer. If anything, I would argue that this film is taking on more of a third-person objective position, in the sense that, yes, you are following the killer through most of the film, but that's exactly what you're doing. You are following the killer. You are not looking at the world through his eyes, right? So essentially what happens is you have this killer that gets resurrected at the beginning. He comes out of the earth, right? Very zombie-like. And then for a lot of it, the camera is placed behind the killer and it's following him along as he's walking throughout the woods. So again, you're taking on more of an objective position. You're taking on more of a follower of this character. But that's not to say that that's what this whole film is. There's a lot of other articles that talk about how the camera placement of this movie almost makes it feel like a video game. And I guess in some parts you could say that that's true, but that's not what it is for the entire film. And there are parts where you're watching the killer and then the camera will pan over to show you something else while the killer's out of the frame doing his own thing. Or it'll give you other types of positioning where maybe you're looking really close up at something, or maybe you're looking at something from the top down, more of a bird's eye point of view. So it's changing the perspective around a little bit. And again, there's never actually a moment where you're seeing what's happening directly through the eyes of the killer. You're just kind of this person that's observing all of the events that are happening. So the camera work in this film is very much keeping you at a distance from both the killer as well as the victims, right? This is not what you see in a typical slasher film which again will often create a sense of intimacy by putting you in the eyes of either the killer or the final girl usually. And because it is a film that is keeping you at a distance from these characters, you really don't learn that much about them. You kind of learn a little bit about the killer and his backstory, what happened to him that turned him into this like bloodthirsty animal essentially. And then you definitely have like the victims that are like coming in, and you get a few scenes with them where you're observing like their conversations. It does do that like classic thing where they're all sitting around the campfire telling ghost stories, and the camera's just kind of going around in a circle. But again, this is all kept at a distance, right? You are just getting like the bare minimum of these characters. They are presented as very annoying people, again, I think very purposefully. Again, just these very like tropey characters, which I think is probably the film poking fun at the typical character tropes that we tend to see in these slasher movies. But it's not like a Friday the 13th film, right, where you're getting to kind of hang out with the characters for a bit before they start dying off. This is what I mean when I say that the film is kind of throwing out the typical narrative structure. There is no sole character that we're following. There is no character arc or any kind of 3-act story structure. The kills in this movie are amazing. Like, I would say go check out this movie just to see the kills alone. There's particularly one scene, and if you've been following this movie or just keeping up on horror news, then you probably know what I'm talking about, just because this tends to be the scene that everyone is talking about when it comes to this movie. But yes, there are some pretty like gnarly kills throughout. There is a lot of gore. I know the writer and director of this film, his background is in prosthetics, so the gore and the guts and all of that is done very well in this film. It is done very creatively, and these were the parts of the films where I would say the audience that I was with, they were loving these scenes the most. These scenes got the most cheers and claps and the biggest laughs throughout the entire movie. And there are some genuinely creepy scenes throughout this movie. One of the things that I loved most about this film is just the aesthetics of it. This is a movie that is shot on actual film. It was shot on 16mm, I believe, and you can tell the aesthetics of it are just gorgeous. It has that like nice nostalgic grainy feel to it. And there are some scenes that are just genuinely creepy. There's one scene that takes place in this like wood cutting shed, I think it is, and it's one of the kill scenes. So you have like the killer and the victim, and there's a woodcutter, so I'm sure you can imagine what happens in this scene. But just the way that it was lit and the way it was shot, like it's mostly like dark. There's only a little bit of light coming through. Also, another interesting thing that this film does is that it does not rely on a musical score of any kind. So there's no music throughout the whole film except for like, you know, the end credits. So all you're hearing throughout the film is like the actual sounds of the environment around you, right? So there's a lot of birds chirping, a lot of like cracking of twigs and leaves as the killer is walking through the woods. And then this scene that I'm talking about, the woodcutter scene, right, it's just the sound of the machinery. And there's something about the combination of like the dark lighting and just the graininess of the film and just the like sounds of it with, again, no music coming in. Like, it just felt so eerie to me. It was so creepy in like the best way, right? Like, it really gave me the feeling that I got when I first started watching slasher films as a young kid. And I really do like the choice of not using any music throughout the film. There is more of a realism that comes into it that I think was a huge benefit for this movie. Again, it just kind of wants you to be this like silent observer to everything that's happening. It's actually a very meditative film in that sense. I know that sounds super pretentious, and well, I think there are people that are going to probably find this movie to actually be really pretentious, but it does have these very meditative moments throughout the entire film. So that's something to keep in mind, that while yes, you are following the killer around, it's not just like 90 minutes of these like super crazy, super gross out kills. There are definitely some of those throughout the movie, and then there are other times where it won't show you the kill at all. Like, it might happen off screen or out of your like point of view. So again, it's definitely a film that is playing with our expectations of the slasher subgenre, and it's a film that's like, it's giving you just enough so you can kind of get the joke and you can have fun with what the killer is doing. But then there are other times where it's going to like pull back from that, right? And it's not going to give you like a satisfying conclusion to a scene. So I think in that respect, some people are going to find this film to be a little frustrating. So there's one kill that happens in the film where the victim turns around and she sees the killer coming at her, and she just kind of like stands there and like waits for him to come and like kill her, which is kind of funny. And again, this is like how it's playing on our expectations of tropes. This is a film that I think wants us to reflect on these expectations that we have within the slasher subgenre. And I think it's playing on the notion that within these kind of films, we as the audience typically go into them just wanting to see a bunch of characters getting killed. Like, at the end of the day, do we really care about who these characters are as people, or do we just want to see the creative ways in which they are getting killed? So in this scene, you have a character that's just kind of embodying that feeling, right? She's just like, okay, the killer's coming at me and I'm just gonna wait here until he stabs me, right? And the movie very much winking at you as an audience and kind of being like, well, isn't this the part that you really wanted to see? Like, you don't really need to see her like running and screaming. Like, let's just get to the good stuff. So those scenes are actually very funny. Like, this is a film that actually has a very strong sense of humor. There are many scenes throughout this where myself and the entire audience were just laughing at what was happening. So it is a very funny movie. They managed to bring in comedy into this in a way that works really well. That being said, the scenes in between, like, the killing or the more comedic moments, the scenes where we're just following the killer as he's walking throughout the woods, those scenes are also funny in their own right, because right, you're following the killer and then it will jump cut. So it'll jump cut from like day to night, or it'll jump cut from one location to another location in the woods. And I feel like that was also playing on just the kind of ridiculousness that we see in these slasher films, where you're having a killer that is just like walking along, moseying along, but somehow they manage to like teleport from one place to another. So I feel like that was something that the jump cuts were playing with that I thought was pretty funny. But there are a lot of scenes of the killer just meandering throughout the woods, and there are times where that gimmick can get a little tiresome. There are certain points where the film started to lag for me a little bit. We kind of got into like these lull moments and I was just like, okay, what's gonna like happen next? Like, the gimmick works for like maybe the first like 30 minutes, and then after that I was kind of waiting for the film to do something else. Like, that's not really a gimmick that you can rely on for a whole 90-minute film, especially when you're choosing to not bring in any traditional narrative elements. I was also trying to figure out like what was the larger like message or theme or question that the movie was trying to pose to us as audience members. And the thing is that I don't know if the writer and director actually had one. I did read and watch some interviews with the writer-director, and it does seem like this was meant to be kind of a gimmick movie where it's like, yes, let's have a slasher film, but then we're just gonna like strip away all of the typical tropes that we expect of these movies. And it's like, okay, but why? Like, what is the purpose of doing that other than like, hey, let's try this experiment and see if it works? And it does seem like there was a lot of improv happening behind the scenes. I know that they did have to go back and refilm a good portion of the movie as well. So it's funny because I think this film works like so well on a technical level. Like, on a technical level, it is amazing, and I would say that anyone that's interested in filmmaking should go watch it. But listening to the writer-director and kind of what was going on behind the scenes, I feel like a lot of the creepiness and a lot of the humor that came out was just kind of a fluke, right? It just kind of all happened to come together. It didn't really seem like they were necessarily going into the film with like these intentions. It seems like there was a lot of just curiosity on the filmmaker's part of kind of like what they could get away with, and just seeing how far they could push an audience before alienating them completely. If you look up interviews with the writer-director of the film, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but he very much describes this as being like slasher genre film meets a Gus Van Sant movie.
And then the rest of Gus Van Sant's films of the same ilk, like Elephant and Last Days, just love them all.
So I feel like that right there is going to tell you whether or not you're going to enjoy seeing a film like this. So again, because they're just kind of like experimenting with all of this stuff, it's not clear to me whether they have like a theme or message that they're trying to get across. Okay, you're deconstructing the slasher film, but what are you trying to say about it? Because usually when you're deconstructing something or subverting something, you're doing that to make like some sort of commentary on whatever it is that you're subverting. Again, that can be subversion of like certain tropes or narrative patterns, or just like things that we tend to see a lot in movies that may play into like certain like stereotypes or just dominant ideas about how we see certain things in the world. A good example of this would be something like Wes Craven's original Scream. That was a film also deconstructing the slasher subgenre. Scream was very much supposed to be kind of commentary or a conversation on how we do revere these horror films, and specifically these horror film killers, and what are the potential consequences of that.
It's a story of 4 or 5 kids who all, as most kids have grown up on horror films, slasher films, whatever you want to call them. And beneath the surface of that, because that's kind of the obvious hook, there's a very interesting set of study of how the kids' perception of what violence is and how do you deal with it, how it switches from their film idea because they're such fans of these films and find them sort of entertaining, they have to sort of change everything to account for it when it actually happens to them in real life. And Scream is very much about the whole world of kids who watch these films, and how it affects their idea of reality.
So Scream is definitely a film that had a very clear intention when it was deconstructing the slasher film. Here, with In a Violent Nature, I just don't see that. Like, I'm just not sure what it's trying to say. And the title, like, In a Violent Nature, yes, nature obviously referring to the woods and the scenery that the film is taking place in, but nature can also refer to just a state of being. And so I was trying to maybe think, like, is this a film that's trying to comment on, again, how we as slasher film audiences or horror audiences, how we like to go into these films, just kind of seeing these very grotesque kills? Is it trying to say, like, there's just something innate within our being that makes us attracted to these kinds of things? And so that's why it's trying to keep us at a distance throughout the whole film. And again, trying to very much bring our attention to the fact that a lot of times we're just waiting for kills to happen. I don't know. I say that and I feel like I'm giving the film like too much credit, because I just am not convinced that that's actually what it was trying to say or do. And then there is stuff with nature happening, and so I was also trying to think, like, okay, maybe this is a film that is commenting on, like, humans using the environment and using it for their own, like, pleasure or their own gains. I mean, my evidence for that is, like, we start off with the killer coming out of the earth, right? He is of earth, and the only way that you can stop him is to put him back into the earth. So you have that happening, and then there's also this conversation that happens at the end of the film between two characters where they're very much referring to the killer as an animal, right? The example that they give in the film is a story about a black bear that attacks someone. So there's definitely this kind of correlation between, like, violent animals, violent nature, and the killer. So I was like, okay, maybe the killer is supposed to be nature, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense either, because it's not like there are explicit scenes throughout this film where we see humans behaving badly towards the environment or seeing them harming the environment in any kind of way. This is not an eco-horror film where you usually have a setup of humans behaving very badly towards the environment and then the environment eventually gets its revenge on the humans. There's none of that happening, so I was also a bit confused on, like, what this film was trying to say about nature and the environment, as well as the horror genre's relationship to nature. And again, I'm not convinced that it was actually trying to say anything. So I feel like this is a movie where the filmmakers were coming in and they were kind of like, okay, we have all these kind of, like, cool, weird, artsy ideas of how we want to make this movie, but I'm not sure that there was really any other intention or larger question behind this deconstruction other than, like, let's see how far we can push the audience before they just get so pissed off at us that they storm out of the theater. One thing that I was curious about as the film was going on was how they were going to incorporate the final girl trope, if they were even going to do that. And I'm not going to spoil anything in this review. I will just say that yes, the final girl does show up at one point, and I did think what they did with her character was kind of hilarious at first. There's just a lot of playing with repetition and the way that these slasher films do tend to be very repetitive. But I will say the thing with the final girl does connect to the ending, and I feel like the ending of this film is really what's going to make or break whether people enjoy it or whether they just get really angry at it. And while we were getting to the ending when I was in the theater, one thing that this film also does really well is building suspense, right? Because again, it is playing on our expectations of the slasher film. And so it's very much, again, using these, like, very repetitive things that we see a lot of times to get us hyped up, get us to think that something is going to happen. And so this was happening at the ending, and I could feel, like, the audience members around me, like, they were kind of at the edge of their seats. They were, like, leaning in, right? They were all waiting for something to happen. I was sitting there and I just had the thought of, like, this film is not going to give you all what you're expecting. And then that's exactly what happened. And you could just, like, feel the energy in the room just, like, completely deflating, and there were so many, like, groans and grumbles from the audience. Like, yes, people were walking out of that theater pissed off at the way that this film chose to end. For me, I feel like the ending does make sense within the context of what they're doing, but yes, I think the ending will upset certain people. Overall, like, do I recommend this film? Again, it's hard to say because I do feel like this is a film that for certain audiences, like, you're just not going to enjoy it. On the other hand, because it is such a technically well-made film and because the aesthetics of it are so beautiful and it is a film that very much lends itself to seeing it on a big screen, part of me does want to say, like, just go and kind of see it and experience it for yourself. Here's what I'll say. If you listen to like this review or other reviews and this seems like something that might be up your alley, then I would definitely say go check it out in a theater if you can. If you're someone that does not like the more experimental approaches to horror, then probably wait for it to come on streaming. But either way, I would say give it a chance, check it out. You know, I'll give the film credit that, you know, it had an idea and it stuck with that idea throughout the entire like 90 minutes. And like I said, there are elements in here that work so well that it's not a film that I would say like skip completely. I would say give it a chance, see what you get out of it. You may go and see something and notice something or have a totally different experience than what I did. Like, I do feel like it is kind of one of those movies. The writer and director of this film has described it as like a nature documentary that just so happens to have a slasher film taking place in it. And it's not like really that either, but that's an idea that I would love to see. I would love to see like a traditional nature documentary, but just have like a slasher film happening in the background. Like, I think that would be hilarious. Or I also feel like something that I wanted from this film is like, you know those like ambiance videos that you see on YouTube where you can just kind of like throw them up on your computer, on your TV and have them on in the background as you're doing work? Like, I almost want something like that for this film because again, the nature shots were so beautiful. Like, I would love to just have like an ambiance video of like the killer walking through this very like beautiful woods or this very beautiful meadow. Maybe every so often there's a kill that happens. Like, I think that would also be really fun. So those are my thoughts on A Violent Nature. I, again, appreciated it for what it was, and I definitely appreciated it on a technical level. I just wish that they had maybe a stronger intention behind some of the choices that they were making and that they were actually, you know, saying something, again, about either the slasher genre. So I feel like that would have given it just a little bit more substance. Have you seen A Violent Nature? If so, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.